Look at that photograph. 11 young men, standing in 2 rows, shoulders squared, chins lifted. Their leather flight jackets catching the morning light. Behind them, the sleek noses of their aircraft point toward a sky that looks almost too blue, too perfect, too innocent for what is about to happen. They are smiling. Every single one of them is smiling. It is the kind of smile that belongs to men who believe they are invincible. The kind of smile that comes from youth, from training, from the absolute certainty that they know exactly what they are doing and exactly where they are going. They have trained for months. They have logged hundreds of hours in the air. They have memorized charts, studied weather patterns, drilled emergency procedures until those procedures live not in their minds but in their muscles, in their bones, in the automatic reflexes of their hands and feet. They are not rookies. They are not careless. They are not afraid. And on that morning in 1938, as that photograph is taken somewhere on the sun-bleached tarmac of a United States military air station on the eastern seaboard, not one of them has any reason to believe that this particular day will be any different from every other training day that came before it. They will take off. They will fly their route. They will land. They will eat dinner. They will write letters home. That is the plan. That has always been the plan. But here's the thing about plans made by human beings in the face of a world that does not care about plans. Sometimes the world wins. 11 men took off that morning. Not one of them ever came back. No distress call reached the tower. No explosion lit up the horizon. No oil slick darkened the surface of the Atlantic. No wreckage washed ashore in the days that followed, or the weeks, or the months. Not a single fragment of metal. Not a single piece of flight gear. Not a single body. Just silence. The kind of silence that is somehow louder than any explosion. The kind of silence that settles into the bones of the people left behind and never fully leaves. The kind of silence that, for the families of 11 young American pilots, would stretch on for not days, not months, not years, but decades. 70 years of silence. 70 years of unanswered questions. 70 years of a mystery so complete, so perfectly unsolvable, that it would eventually stop feeling like a tragedy and start feeling like something else entirely. Something darker. Something that whispered, in the quiet hours of the night, that perhaps there are places on this earth where the normal rules do not apply, where trained men with good equipment and clear skies can simply cease to exist, where the ocean swallows everything whole and gives nothing back. For 70 years, the sea kept it secret. Then, in 2008, a group of divers found something at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean that should not have been there. And suddenly, the silence broke. But what came out of that silence was not the answer anyone was hoping for. What came out was something far more disturbing. Something that raised a question so unsettling that investigators, historians, and scientists are still arguing about it today. Because the question is no longer simply, what happened to 11 pilots in 1938? The question is, what happened to them before they went into the water? To understand what happened to those 11 men, you have to understand the world they existed in. Not just the year, not just the geography, but the texture of the time, the weight of it. Because 1938 was not a gentle year. It was not a year of ease or certainty. It was a year that felt, to many Americans, like the world was quietly but unmistakably tilting toward the edge of something terrible. In Europe, a man named Adolf Hitler had just marched his troops into Austria. The newspapers were full of photographs that made grown men go quiet. Japan was tearing through China with a ferocity that shocked even the most hardened military observers. The old certainties that had held the world together since the end of the Great War were crumbling, one by one, and everyone with eyes could see it, even if most people were still hoping they were wrong. In the United States, the military was watching all of this with a combination of professional concern and agent self-assessment. The American Armed Forces of 1938 were not the colossal war machine they would become just a few years later. They were leaner. They were stretched. They were, in many critical areas, still catching up with the pace of change that modern warfare demanded. And so training was constant. Missions went up regularly, not just to drill pilots in the mechanics of flight, but to test navigation, to test communication, to test the capacity of American airmen to operate effectively over the open ocean, far from shore, far from easy landmarks, far from help. That is exactly what the 11 pilots were doing on the morning they disappeared. Their air station sat on the eastern edge of the American coastline, in that zone where the land finally surrenders to the Atlantic and the horizon becomes nothing but open water in every direction. The base was functional rather than beautiful. Rows of barracks, a long, flat runway, fuel depots, radio towers, the constant smell of aviation fuel and salt air that everyone stationed there eventually stopped noticing. The aircraft they flew were not experimental prototypes. They were not untested machines fresh from some engineer's drawing board. They were reliable, proven military planes, the kind that had been flying without incident for years. Their engines were maintained by ground crews who knew every bolt, every fitting, every potential fault point in those machines the way a surgeon knows anatomy. There was nothing wrong with the aircraft. There was nothing wrong with the men flying them. The mission itself was categorized as routine. That word, routine, it appears in the official documentation with a kind of cruel irony that gets more painful the longer you look at it. Routine training flight, routine navigation exercise, routine departure time, routine flight path out over the Atlantic, east and slightly south, into the zone of open water that in just a few years would become famous, or perhaps infamous, for reasons that had nothing to do with any military training exercise. The morning of the mission was, by all accounts, unremarkable. The weather was clay. Not just acceptable, but genuinely clay. High-pressure systems sitting over the region, keeping the skies blue and the winds moderate. The kind of flying weather that military pilots dream about. No excuse for confusion. No excuse for disorientation. No reason on earth to deviate from the plan. The crew chief who performed the final checks on the aircraft that morning would later tell investigators that every single plane was in perfect condition. Full fuel. All instruments functioning. Radio equipment tested and confirmed operational. The pilots themselves, when they gathered for the pre-flight briefing, were described by those who were there as relaxed, focused, professional. Some of them joked with each other, the easy banter of men who have trained together long enough to know each other's rhythms. There was no tension, no anxiety, no premonition. No one pulled aside a friend and said, quietly, "I have a strange feeling about today." No one lingered a moment too long before climbing into the cockpit. They simply flew. 11 planes rising one after another from the runway, climbing through the clean morning air, banking east over the Atlantic, shrinking to silver specks against the blue and then disappearing over the horizon. And the people on the ground who watched them go didn't feel fear. They felt nothing unusual at all. Because this was routine. Because these were professionals. Because there was absolutely no reason to think that those 11 silver specks disappearing over the eastern horizon would be the last anyone ever saw of them. It was supposed to be just another day. It was the last day of everything. For the first 90 minutes, everything was normal. The radio operators at the base maintained intermittent contact with the flight formation as it moved east over the Atlantic. The pilots checked in at the expected intervals. Their positions tracked correctly with the planned route. There were no anomalies in the early transmissions. No concern in the voices coming over the crackling radio frequencies. Just the clipped, professional language of trained military pilots doing exactly what they had done dozens of times before. An hour in, the formation had reached its first navigation checkpoint approximately 80 miles offshore. The lead pilot checked in with a control tower. Position confirmed. All aircraft accounted for. Weather still clay. Proceeding to the next waypoint. Normal. But somewhere in the second hour, something changed. The exact moment is impossible to pinpoint, because the change didn't announce itself. There was no sudden emergency call. No explosion of distress codes. Whatever happened to those 11 men in that second hour, it did not happen in an instant. It crept in. It built slowly, like a pressure behind the eyes, like the first subtle wrongness that you can sense before you can name. The first sign that something was wrong came through the radio at approximately 11:45 in the morning. One of the pilots, his voice carrying none of the alarm that the content of his words probably should have carried, because trained pilots do not panic. They simply report, made contact with the base. Control, we're having some difficulty confirming our position. The radio operator at the base asked him to clarify. The compass is giving us a strange reading. We've attempted to cross-reference with visual landmarks, but we're over open water. Visibility is clear, but I'm not able to confirm our location. This was unusual, but not yet alarming. Compass issues happened. Equipment malfunctioned. The radio operator told the pilot to hold his course and verify against the secondary navigation instruments. There was a pause. A long one, longer than the distance alone could account for. Then the voice came back. Control, we are confirming the issue across multiple aircraft. Several of us are showing inconsistent compass readings. The ocean it doesn't look right. The radio operator asked what he meant. Another pause. The color. The water. It doesn't look right. Control, we're not sure where we are. The base commander, who had been summoned to the radio room by this point, took over the communication. He asked the lead pilot to describe what he was seeing. He asked for altitude, airspeed, fuel state. He asked calm, systematic questions in the way that military training teaches you to respond to abnormal situations, with process, with structure, with a disciplined application of procedure to the chaos of the unexpected. The lead pilot answered some of the questions. He gave altitude. He gave airspeed. His fuel state was still adequate. But then, in the middle of a sentence, his voice shifted. It was a small shift, the kind that you might not notice if you weren't listening very carefully. But the radio operator who was present that day would describe it years later in an interview as the moment he first felt cold. Not afraid, exactly, just cold. Because the voice of the lead pilot, a man known for his composure, a man who had logged more flight hours than almost anyone at that base, suddenly sounded uncertain in a way that had nothing to do with navigation. Control, the voice said, and there was something in it that the radio operator could never quite describe precisely, something between confusion and a kind of stunned disbelief. Everything looks wrong. That was the last coherent transmission. What followed in the next 4 minutes was a series of fragmented communications that the radio operator struggled to interpret in real time, and that investigators would spend months afterward trying to reconstruct. There were brief words, partial sentences. At one point, what sounded like multiple pilots attempting to communicate simultaneously, their voices overlapping in a wash of static and broken syllables. And then, over the course of what was later estimated to be no more than 90 seconds, the communications ended. Not with a bang. Not with a final desperate call for help. Not with an explosion or a scream or any of the dramatic endings that the human mind tends to reach for when it tries to imagine catastrophe. Just silence. One channel going quiet, then another, until all 11 were gone. The radio operator sat for a moment, his headset pressed to his ears, listening to the static that was suddenly the only thing coming from that vast stretch of Atlantic sky. Then he reached for the phone. "I need the base commander," he said. "Right now." Within 2 hours of the last transmission, the United States military had launched one of the most intensive search and rescue operations in its peacetime history up to that point. It began with aircraft. Other pilots already on the ground were scrambled and sent east, following the last known trajectory of the missing formation. They flew in expanding search patterns, systematic grids designed to cover the maximum possible area in the minimum possible time. They flew low enough to spot debris on the water. They flew until they were at the edge of their fuel range and then turned back to refuel and went out again. Naval vessels were diverted from their regular routes and sent to the search area. Ships with trained spotters on their decks, scanning the water's surface with binoculars, covering miles of ocean in methodical sweeps. A missing aircraft leaves traces on the ocean surface. Everyone involved in the search operation knew this. Fuel, oil, metal fragments, seat cushions, life jackets, survival gear, personal effects. An aircraft that goes into the water does not disappear cleanly. The ocean is brutal but imprecise. It absorbs catastrophe, but it rarely keeps all of it. The people conducting the search were not pessimistic. They were professionals. They followed the procedures that had been established precisely for situations like this. They expanded their search zone gradually as time passed, and the initial area came up empty. They radioed merchant shipping in the region and asked their crews to watch for any sign of wreckage or survivors. They established a command post and a communications network, and they worked the problem with the systematic intensity of people who still believed, for those first critical hours, that they were going to find something. They found nothing. Not on the first day. Not on the second day. By the third day, the absence of any debris had shifted from puzzling to genuinely disturbing. Aircraft that go down over open water leave some trace. This is not a theory. This is an established fact built from decades of accident investigation. The ocean is not deep everywhere. The search area, based on the last known positions of the aircraft and the time elapsed since the last transmission, was not unreasonable. The weather during the search was clear. Visibility was good. Spotters were experienced. But there was nothing. No metal. No fuel slick shimmering on the surface. No equipment. No clothing. No personal items. No bodies. No trace of any kind that 11 aircraft carrying 11 men had ever been in that part of the sky at all. On the fourth day, the search coordinator filed a report that used language that was careful and bureaucratic, and somehow, underneath all the careful bureaucratic language, quietly horrified. He wrote that the absence of any surface debris was, quote, inconsistent with any known pattern of aircraft loss over open water. He wrote that the search had been conducted with all available resources and that it would be extended, but that the current evidence was, quote, insufficient to establish either the location or the cause of the incident. He was a man trained to deal in facts and procedures and measurable outcomes, and he was writing a report about something that had produced no facts, violated every procedure, and delivered an outcome that simply did not fit any category in any manual he had ever read. The families were notified. 11 families, scattered across the country, receiving visits from officers in dress uniforms with faces composed into expressions of professional compassion. The language used in those conversations was, by necessity, incomplete, missing, no confirmed wreckage, search ongoing, every effort being made. Hold on to hope. It is a particular kind of cruelty, this kind of loss, because there is no body to bury. There is no grave to stand beside. There is no physical marker between the world of the living and the world of the dead. The missing man exists in a terrible suspended state, neither confirmed gone nor provably present, and the family is left stranded in the same suspension, unable to grieve fully, unable to move on completely, unable to do anything but wait for an answer that may never come. The search was officially scaled back after 2 weeks. It was never formally closed, but in practical terms, it ended. The ships went back to their regular routes. The aircraft returned to their normal duties. The command post was dismantled. The files were compiled, catalogued, and forwarded up the chain of command to people with broader responsibilities who read them carefully and wrote their own careful reports and added them to a growing collection of documents that asked, in various formal ways, what had happened. None of them had an answer. The official conclusion, rendered after months of investigation, was that the aircraft had been lost due to a combination of navigation failure and adverse environmental conditions. It noted the compass anomalies reported in the final transmissions. It noted that the area of ocean in question was known for unpredictable and sometimes rapid weather changes. It noted that a catastrophic structural failure or loss of control in multiple aircraft simultaneously could, under certain circumstances, result in a rapid descent that left little surface debris. It was not a satisfying explanation. Even the people who wrote it knew it was not satisfying. You can read that in the footnotes, in the carefully hedged language, In the number of times phrases like may have and possibly and could potentially account for appear in a document that is supposed to be offering definitive conclusions. They were explaining the inexplicable with the tools they had, and the tools were not adequate for the job. So the files were archived. The families waited. The ocean kept its secret. And the world moved on. Because the world always moves on. Because it has no choice. And because 1938 was already filling up with new horrors that would soon make the loss of 11 pilots in the Atlantic seem, to everyone except the people who loved them, like a small and distant thing. There is a region of the Atlantic Ocean shaped roughly like a triangle. Its 3 points are generally marked as Miami, Florida, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico. It covers approximately 500,000 square miles of open water. For most of its existence, it was simply ocean. Blue, vast, indifferent. Ships passed through it. Aircraft flew over it. Fish lived in it. It had no name beyond its geography. It had no reputation beyond its weather, which could be unpredictable, and its depth, which in some places is extraordinary. Then things started to happen in it. Not all at once. Not in any sudden dramatic cluster that would have forced immediate attention. But over decades, accumulating slowly, a pattern began to emerge, or at least something that looked enough like a pattern to make people take notice. Ships that departed from one port and were expected at another, and never arrived. Aircraft on routine flights that sent their last transmission and then fell silent. In most cases, no wreckage. In most cases, no bodies. In most cases, the same terrible absence that had swallowed 11 pilots in 1938, repeated again and again in this particular stretch of ocean. The most famous disappearance in this region happened in December 1945, just 7 years after the 11 pilots vanished. 5 Navy Avenger torpedo bombers, Flight 19, took off from Fort Lauderdale Naval Air Station on a routine training mission and disappeared over the Atlantic. 14 men. Their last radio transmissions described compass malfunctions and confusion about their position. A rescue aircraft sent to search for them also disappeared. 27 men in total, gone in a single afternoon. No wreckage. No bodies. Nothing. It was after Flight 19 that the region began to develop its reputation in the public consciousness. Journalists wrote about it. Researchers began collecting accounts of other disappearances in the same area, going back decades. The losses began to accumulate into something that felt less like a series of unfortunate coincidences and more like evidence of something fundamentally wrong with that particular stretch of ocean. In 1964, a journalist named Vincent Gaddis published an article that used the phrase Bermuda Triangle for the first time in print. The term caught fire. Books followed. Magazine articles. Television documentaries. The Bermuda Triangle became not just a geographic location, but a cultural symbol, a shorthand for the terrifying possibility that the world contains places where normal rules do not apply, where human technology and human skill and human preparation count for nothing, where you can simply vanish without explanation and never be found. The theories multiplied with the interest. Some were grounded in actual science and genuine investigation. Methane hydrates on the ocean floor, capable of releasing sudden massive gas bubbles that could sink ships without warning. Unusual magnetic anomalies in the region that could throw off compass readings and navigation equipment. Rapid and unpredictable weather systems capable of generating waterspouts and sudden violent storms with very little warning. The Gulf Stream, moving through the triangle at extraordinary speed, capable of dispersing wreckage and eliminating surface evidence of a crash far faster than anywhere else in the Atlantic. Other theories went further, much further. Time distortions, underwater alien bases, portals to other dimensions. The lost civilization of Atlantis, allegedly resting on the ocean floor beneath the triangle, emitting energy fields that interfered with modern technology in ways that science could not explain. Most serious researchers dismissed the more exotic theories while acknowledging that the conventional ones were also incomplete. Because the honest answer, The answer that careful investigators kept arriving at when they stripped away both the supernatural speculation and the official dismissiveness was that the Bermuda Triangle did appear to have an unusually high rate of disappearances, and that some of those disappearances, including the 11 pilots of 1938, did not fit neatly into any of the conventional explanations. The compasses malfunctioning. The pilots confused about their position despite clear weather and functioning instruments. The description of the ocean looking wrong. The absolute absence of any debris despite an extensive search in relatively shallow water. These details nagged at researchers for decades. And the families of the 11 pilots, reading about the Bermuda Triangle in newspapers and books as the years passed, felt something complicated. On one hand, there was a strange comfort in knowing that what had happened to their fathers, their brothers, their sons, was not simply a failure, not negligence, not error. Something else had taken them, something that had taken others too, something that defied easy explanation. On the other hand, it meant that the mystery was real, that the official explanation, the navigational error, the adverse conditions, the convenient bureaucratic resolution, was not the truth. And if that explanation was not the truth, then the truth was something larger and stranger and more frightening, and it was still out there, somewhere under 70 feet of dark Atlantic water, waiting to be found. Time does something to a mystery that nothing else can. It does not solve it. It does not simplify it. What time does to an unsolved mystery is press it down into the deeper layers of the culture, the way sediment presses down into rock, until it becomes something dense and permanent and foundational. Until the families of the missing grow old and their children grow old and the people who actually knew the 11 pilots become fewer and fewer, and eventually the last person who could say, "I flew with him. I shook his hand. I heard his voice that morning," that person goes too. And then the 11 pilots exist only in documents and photographs and the particular ache of family memory that is passed down through generations not as fresh grief but as old sorrow. The 1940s came and went. The Second World War swallowed the world and remade it. And the 11 missing pilots were absorbed into a much larger accounting of loss. Hundreds of thousands of Americans died in that war. Tens of millions of people died across the globe. The disappearance of 11 men in 1938 was not forgotten exactly, but it was contextualized, placed into a category of wartime and near-wartime loss that made it less singular, less shocking, more part of a terrible whole. The 1950s, the 1960s, the world rebuilding itself. New technologies, new possibilities, new reasons for optimism and new reasons for fear. The Cold War replacing one kind of existential anxiety with another. The families of the 11 pilots living their lives, raising children, growing older, because life insists on continuing even when some part of you never fully comes back from a certain point in the past. The fathers who had been waiting for news of their sons grew old and died without receiving it. The mothers who had kept photographs on their mantelpieces, who had refused for years to fully accept that their children were gone because there was no body, no proof, only absence. Those mothers too eventually accepted what the absence meant, and they too grew old and died. And the photographs stayed on the mantelpieces, but the weight behind them changed, became less immediate, more memorial. Children grew up being told about an uncle they never met, a grandfather they knew only from a single photograph of a group of young men standing in front of military aircraft, squinting into the sun, smiling. Some of those children became intensely curious about what had happened. They wrote letters to the military requesting access to the investigation files. They contacted historians and aviation researchers and organizations dedicated to documenting unexplained disappearances. Some of them traveled to the Florida coast and stood on beaches and looked out of the Atlantic and tried to feel something specific, tried to feel a connection to a man who had once flown east over that same water and never come back. The military files on the incident were declassified in stages over the decades, as all military records of that era eventually were. When researchers and family members finally gained access to the full investigative record, They found what they had expected: careful documentation of the search operation, the radio transcripts, the official conclusions. But they also found something they had not fully expected, which was the depth of the investigators' own uncertainty, visible between the formal lines of official language, the sense that the people responsible for solving this mystery had understood, even at the time, that their explanation was inadequate. One investigating officer, in a handwritten note appended to his official report and clearly not intended for general circulation, wrote simply, "We have not explained this. We have documented it and called it explained, and that is not the same thing." That note sat in a military archive for 60 years before anyone read it. In 2008, a retired naval historian went through those files as part of a broader research project on unexplained incidents in the Atlantic. He read the note. He sat with it for a long time. Then he picked up the phone and called an old colleague who had connections to a deep-sea exploration team operating in the Western Atlantic. He said, "I think we need to look at something." The year 2008. 70 years since 11 pilots had taken off and never landed. The exploration team that received the call was not a military operation. They were a private deep-sea research group, the kind that had proliferated in the late 20th and early 21st centuries as the technology for deep underwater exploration became both more accessible and more sophisticated. Side-scan sonar, remotely operated vehicles, advanced diving equipment that could take trained divers to depths that would have been impossible a generation earlier. The team had done work in the Atlantic before, documenting submerged geological features, surveying potential archaeological sites, occasionally assisting with official investigations into modern aircraft and ship losses. They were cautious, methodical people, scientists by training and temperament. They were not treasure hunters, not sensationalists, not the kind of people who went looking for the extraordinary and saw it in the ordinary. If anything, their professional instinct ran in the opposite direction. They had been to enough sites that had been described to them in terms of mystery and anomaly and had turned out to have perfectly mundane explanations, that their default orientation was skepticism. When the historian called, the team leader listened carefully to what he had to say. The coordinates derived from the last known positions of the aircraft, the nature of the bottom topography in that area, which was shallower than most people assumed, an extended shelf before the drop into deep ocean, which meant that aircraft debris, if any had fallen there, would potentially still be present and accessible. The historical record, the note in the handwritten margin. The team leader was not immediately convinced that this was worth a significant investment of time and resources. He had seen too many promising leads dissolve into nothing to get excited before the data supported excitement. But something in the combination of the historical record and the specific geography made him interested enough to agree to include the coordinates in the survey area of a planned expedition that was already being organized for the following spring. It was not the primary objective of the expedition. It was added almost as an afterthought, the nautical equivalent of checking a box on a list, doing due diligence on a long cold lead because the opportunity was there and the cost of including it was marginal. The expedition launched in late spring of 2008. 4 weeks of planned fieldwork in the Western Atlantic, covering a survey area that included several sites of historical and geological interest. The team spent the first 2 weeks on other objectives: side-scan sonar sweeps of a submerged geological formation, documentation of a 19th century merchant wreck that had been incompletely surveyed in a previous expedition, standard fieldwork, productive and satisfying in the quiet, cumulative way that scientific fieldwork tends to be. In the 3rd week, they moved to the coordinates that the historian had provided. The first sonar pass revealed nothing unusual. The bottom topography in the area was relatively flat, covered in fine sediment, with occasional rock outcroppings. No obvious anomalies. The team lead made a note in the expedition log and prepared to move on to the next survey site. Then one of the sonar technicians flagged something on the screen. A shadow. A series of geometric anomalies in the sediment profile, barely distinguishable from the surrounding seabed. The kind of thing that, on its own, could be rock formation, Could be natural irregularity, could be anything. But to a trained eye, the geometry had a quality that natural formations rarely produce. It looked almost like structure. The team decided to send down a ROV for a visual confirmation before committing to a dive. The remotely operated vehicle descended through the water column on its tether, its cameras feeding live images back to the monitor screens in the control room on the surface. The team crowded around the screens as the vehicle approached the bottom. The first images were murky, sediment disturbed by the vehicle's approach. The cameras adjusted, and then, gradually, shapes began to emerge from the sea flue. One of the team members, watching the screen, said something quietly that the team lead would later describe as the most understated comment he had ever heard in a career full of significant moments. Those, the team member said, leaning forward toward the screen, are not rocks. What they found was not what anyone had expected to find. Not exactly. When the divers went down the following morning, after a careful review of the ROV footage and extensive consultation about safety protocols and documentation procedures, they descended into water that was darker than the surface suggested. The kind of darkness that is not absolute but is rather a specific shade of deep blue-green that filters out everything warm and replaces it with something cold and old and immeasurably patient. They descended to approximately 70 feet before the bottom came into view. And there, half buried in fine Atlantic sediment, covered in coral growth and the slow patient accretion of 70 years of marine life, were the unmistakable shapes of aircraft. Not one, multiple. The divers moved through the site carefully, following the documentation protocol, their cameras running continuously, their movements slow and deliberate in the way of experienced underwater workers who know that haste is the enemy of both safety and science. They did not touch anything. They circled. They filmed. They measured, as precisely as the conditions allowed. The aircraft were military. That was immediately apparent from the overall configuration, from the size and shape, from the design elements visible beneath the coral. They were not modern aircraft. They were decades old, their construction dating clearly to the mid-20th century, and the specific design features that the divers could identify were consistent with the aircraft type that had been operated by the United States military in the late 1930s. That alignment was the first extraordinary thing. Not surprising, exactly, because they had come to these coordinates specifically because of the connection to the 1938 disappearance, and finding aircraft debris consistent with that period in the area where those aircraft had last been reported was exactly what they were looking for. But knowing intellectually that something might be there and actually seeing it with your own eyes through 60 feet of dark water were two fundamentally different experiences, and the divers who were present that day would later describe a feeling that was difficult to categorize. Not triumph, exactly. Not excitement in the conventional sense. Something more complex. Something that sat closer to grief. Because these were not simply artifacts. These were the resting places of 11 men. Except the site was strange. The more time the divers spent moving through it, documenting it, the more a specific quality of wrongness began to accumulate in their observations. Not dramatic wrongness. Not obvious wrongness. The subtle kind. The kind that does not announce itself but builds slowly in the back of the mind as a collection of small details that individually seem unremarkable but together add up to something that does not fit. The aircraft were close together. Too close together. Aircraft that come down in a catastrophic loss over open water, in the chaos of whatever emergency or structural failure brings them down, do not land in neat formation on the seabed. They spread. They scatter. The dynamics of a high-speed descent, the physics of impact, the current and the conditions, all of these factors work against concentration. Wreckage fields spread. They do not cluster, but these aircraft were clustered, positioned relative to each other in a way that, one of the divers would later describe in the expedition report, suggested something closer to a deliberate arrangement than a random fall. Then there was the question of impact evidence. When a military aircraft hits the water from altitude, it does not sit down gently. It hits hard. The energy involved in that kind of impact is enormous. It deforms metal. It shatters structures. It creates a recognizable pattern of damage that forensic investigators and aviation archaeologists have documented extensively from known crash sites. High-velocity water impact leaves specific, identifiable marks. The team's aviation specialist, brought in to assist with the assessment once the initial survey data had been reviewed, spent 3 days examining the footage and the measurements before delivering his assessment. The damage pattern, he said, was not consistent with high-velocity impact. It was consistent with something closer to a controlled ditching, a water landing, an attempt to set the aircraft down on the ocean surface rather than crash into it at speed. The difference between those two scenarios is profound. A crash is a loss of control. A ditching is, at least in its intent, the opposite. A ditching is a pilot making a decision. A pilot who is conscious, who is in sufficient control of his aircraft, who has enough time and enough awareness to attempt a controlled descent to the water rather than simply falling. A pilot who knew he was going down, and chose, in those last moments, to try to save himself and his crew. That detail sat in the expedition report like a splinter. Small, sharp, impossible to ignore. If the aircraft had been ditched rather than crashed, it meant the pilots had been alive and in control at the moment of water contact. It meant that whatever had caused the compass anomalies and the navigational confusion had not immediately destroyed the aircraft or killed the crews. It meant there had been time. Moments, perhaps, or maybe more. And it raised a question that none of the investigators had fully articulated yet, but that was already beginning to form at the edges of every conversation, in the silences between the careful scientific language. If the pilots ditched rather than crashed, where were the bodies? This is the part of the story where the evidence stops providing answers and starts multiplying questions. The team spent 2 additional weeks on site after the initial discovery, conducting the most thorough possible documentation of the wreck field. They brought in additional specialists, a forensic archaeologist, a military aviation historian, a marine biologist who could assess the growth patterns on the aircraft and help establish a more precise timeline for their submersion. They worked methodically and carefully, and they produced a body of documentation that would eventually become the foundation for an extensive published report. That report, when it finally emerged, was careful and precise and scientific. It stated its findings clearly and without sensationalism. It described the aircraft configuration, the damage patterns, the absence of expected impact markers, the unusual clustering of the wrecks. It described the correspondence between the aircraft models and the type operated by the United States military in 1938. It noted the coordinates and their relationship to the last known position of the missing flight. And then, in measured and cautious scientific language, it described the absence of human remains. In 70 years of submersion, human remains will not survive in open ocean conditions. This is a biological and chemical reality that the team acknowledged fully and directly in their report. Soft tissue is gone within years in salt water, even at depth. Bone can survive longer but is susceptible to the same processes over a long enough time. The absence of skeletal remains after 7 decades was not, in itself, unexplained. But the team's forensic specialist noted something in the sediment composition around the aircraft that was, in his considered professional judgment, inconsistent with the presence of human remains even accounting for their decomposition. The sediment had been analyzed for organic markers, for the chemical signatures that human biological material leaves in the surrounding environment even after it is physically dissolved. The results were, the specialist wrote, ambiguous, but in the direction of suggesting that the concentration of organic material consistent with human remains was lower than would be expected even accounting for dispersal and decomposition over 70 years. What this meant, if it meant anything, was debated intensely among the team members and, later, among the wider research community. One interpretation was that the absence of expected organic markers was simply the result of current patterns and sediment movement over 70 years, dispersing and diluting any remnants beyond detectable levels. This was scientifically plausible. It could not be ruled out. Another interpretation was harder to hold in the mind without feeling the ground shift slightly beneath you. If the pilots had ditched their aircraft, and if the evidence of organic material was genuinely lower than expected, then there was a window, however narrow, however unlikely, for a different sequence of events. In that different sequence, the aircraft went into the water under at least partial control. The pilots survived the impact, or at least some of them did. They were in the water, in the Atlantic, in life vests or without them, in an area that search vessels would not reach for hours and that the most intensive ocean search in American peacetime history would somehow fail to find. Then what? This is where the science ends and the impossible begins to breathe. One of the researchers, presenting the findings at a conference a year after the discovery, said something that was quoted widely afterward. She was a careful scientist, known for her rigorous methodology and her deep resistance to speculation. She had spent her career studying the physical record of the past, drawing conclusions from evidence, refusing to go further than the data would support. She said, "I can tell you what the evidence shows. I can tell you what the damage patterns mean. I can tell you about the clustering and the organic markers in the timeline. What I cannot tell you is what happened between the moment those aircraft entered the water and the moment they became the quiet seabed site my team spent 2 weeks documenting. That gap, those hours or days or weeks between those two moments, that is not something the physical evidence can answer. And I find, somewhat to my own surprise, that the absence of that answer is more disturbing to me than anything else we found." She paused. "I have been studying wreck sites for 25 years, she said. "I have seen a lot of things at the bottom of the ocean. This site feels different. Not because it is dramatic, not because of anything I can precisely quantify, but because it raises a question that I cannot dismiss, which is, these men went into that water. They went in with enough control to make something resembling a landing. And then they were gone, and nothing we have found tells us where they went." The room was very quiet. After the discovery was published, after the initial wave of media attention broke and receded, what remained was the scientific community working the problem with the tools available and the public doing what the public always does with a mystery that has not been solved, which is to fill the silence with everything imaginable. The rational theories were reviewed and debated and found, if not fully satisfying, at least partially credible. The most scientifically grounded explanation centered on a phenomenon that researchers have been documenting with increasing sophistication in the decades leading up to the discovery. Methane hydrate deposits exist in significant concentrations beneath the sediment of the Atlantic seafloor in various locations, including the region of the Bermuda Triangle. Under certain conditions, these deposits can be destabilized and release massive quantities of methane gas in a sudden upwelling. The result is a dramatic reduction in the density of the water in the affected area, which can cause ships to lose buoyancy and sink with almost no warning. More relevant to the 1938 disappearance, the release of methane gas in sufficient quantities into the atmosphere above such an upwelling could theoretically affect aircraft. Not mechanically, not structurally, but through the air itself. Methane is asphyxiating at sufficient concentration. It displaces oxygen. And if 11 aircraft flew into a concentrated methane release above an ocean degassing event, the effects on the crews could have been rapid, severe, and disorienting in ways that would perfectly match the final transmissions. The confused navigation. The compass anomalies, explainable by the electromagnetic properties of large methane releases. The sense that everything looked wrong. The ocean surface above a significant methane release has a specific visual quality, a kind of roiling, bubbling disturbance that an affected pilot, already hypoxic from oxygen displacement, might describe in exactly those words. If the crews were incapacitated by methane exposure but the aircraft were on autopilot or in stable flight attitudes, they might have descended gradually rather than catastrophically. They might have come down in something resembling a controlled glide even as the pilots themselves were unconscious. That would explain the ditching pattern. That would explain the clustering. If the aircraft had been flying in tight formation at the time of the event and went down together within the same limited zone. And it would explain the absence of survivors, because men rendered unconscious by methane exposure and ditched in the Atlantic Ocean in 1938, miles from shore, with no rescue assets anywhere near the site, would have had no chance. They would have entered the water and never regained consciousness, and the Atlantic would have taken them the way it takes everything it receives, completely and permanently. It is a plausible explanation. Scientists working in the field of marine methane dynamics have described it as not just plausible but possibly probable. The geological features of the area support it. The timeline supports it. The symptomology matches. But it does not answer everything. It does not explain why a search conducted within hours of the disappearance, in relatively shallow water, in clear conditions, found no debris. Even a controlled ditching leaves wreckage visible on the surface. Aircraft that go into the water do not submerge intact, regardless of how gently they land. They break up. They spread parts across the surface. The search had nothing. Not one fragment. The current patterns in the area are complex, and the Gulf Stream runs through the triangle with unusual speed and volume, capable of moving surface debris at rates that can make an impact site look clean within hours. This is a real phenomenon. It has been documented in modern aircraft losses in the same region. It could account for the absence of surface debris. But could it account for all of it? Every fragment, every piece of equipment, every personal effect. And then there is the question that returns, always, to the center of any serious analysis of this case. The question that the careful scientist at the conference voiced. The question that sits under every theory and every explanation and every careful accumulation of data. What happened in that gap? Between the final transmissions and the quiet seabed. Between 11 living, breathing, skilled, frightened men and the silent shapes half buried in Atlantic sediment. What happened in that space of time that left no trace, no evidence, nothing that any instrument in 2008 could detect, and no survivor and no witness and no answer? When the discovery was announced, it reached people who had spent their entire lives waiting for it. Not the original families. Most of them were gone. The parents who had waited by the radio for news that never came, who had kept photographs on mantelpieces for decades, who had died with the absence of an answer as a permanent companion. They were buried in their own graves by 2008, in cemeteries across America, many of them in plots they had always imagined would someday be accompanied by the remains of a son or a brother who had gone up into a Florida sky 70 years ago and never come down. But their children were still alive, and their grandchildren. And when the news broke, those people, the sons and daughters and grandchildren of the 11 pilots, began to find each other, drawn together by the common thread of this sudden, late, incomplete resolution that the discovery represented. There was a woman in Ohio whose grandfather had been the lead pilot of the formation. She had grown up with the story. Her father had told it to her in the way that family stories are told. Not dramatically, not with embellishment, but with the quiet weight of something that never fully resolved itself. A gap in the family history that had been described to her simply as, "This is what happened to your grandfather," and no one knows exactly why. She had done her own research over the years. She had read the declassified files. She had read the books about the Bermuda Triangle, not the sensational ones, but the serious ones, the ones written by people who were trying to understand rather than to entertain. She had looked at the photograph that you are looking at right now. Those 11 men in their leather jackets, and she had tried to identify which face belonged to the grandfather she had never met, and she believed she knew, though she was never entirely certain. When the discovery was announced, she was 62 years old. She called her son, who was 35 and had grown up hearing the same story she had grown up hearing, and she said, "They found the planes." And there was a silence on the phone, and then her son said, "Did they find him?" And she said, truthfully and gently, "No, but they found where he went." That distinction, the difference between knowing where someone went and knowing what happened to them, is a distinction that the families of the missing understand in a way that most people never have to. It is a partial closure. It is the boundary of what the physical world can provide when it has decided to keep its deepest secret. It is the difference between the ache of absolute absence and the quieter ache of knowing that the ocean held them, that the ocean has held them for 70 years, that the place where they ended is a specific set of coordinates on a chart and not a void without location. It is not enough. It will never be enough. But it is something. The woman in Ohio made a decision in the weeks after the discovery. She reached out to the research team that had found the planes. She asked if it would be possible to return to the site, not to disturb anything, not to excavate, simply to go there, to be above that place, to say, in whatever imprecise and human way these things can be said, that the people who came from those 11 men had found them, had come to them, had not forgotten. The team agreed. In the autumn of 2009, a small boat carried her and 3 members of the research team to the coordinates in the Western Atlantic. The day was clear. The water was blue, the specific blue of the Atlantic in autumn when the summer heat has left it and it has settled into something cooler and more austere. She stood at the rail and looked down into the water for a long time. Then she reached into the bag she had brought with her and took out 11 white flowers. She dropped them one by one into the water and watched them spread across the surface, carried slowly apart by the current, moving away from each other but remaining, for a long time, visible. She did not say anything. There was nothing adequate to say. She just watched the flowers until she could not see them anymore. There is something that the ocean has that we do not. Time. The ocean has been here for approximately 4.5 billion years, and it will be here long after the last human being has stopped looking at it, and everything that it has received during those billions of years it has held with complete indifference, because the ocean does not care about what it keeps. It does not preserve things out of sentiment or significance. It preserves them according to physics and chemistry and the specific properties of salt water and sediment and pressure, and it keeps some things and dissolves others and rearranges still others, not according to any human sense of what matters, but according to its own logic. In 2008, for reasons that have as much to do with technology and funding and the particular curiosity of a retired historian as with anything the ocean chose to reveal, some of what it had been keeping since 1938 became visible. Aircraft. The shapes of aircraft, settled into the sediment, draped in coral, inhabited by fish that had no awareness that these structures had ever been anything other than part of the seabed. The coral did not grow with any knowledge of what it was growing on. The fish that moved through the broken fuselages and the corroded frames were not keeping vigil. They were simply living, in the way that life fills every available space with more life, regardless of what that space once was. But we know, the living, the people who come from the same human tradition that produced 11 young pilots in leather jackets who stood on a sunny tarmac and smiled for a photograph, we know what those shapes are. We know what they held and who they carried and what they meant. And that knowing is both a comfort and an accusation. A comfort because it means those 11 men are not simply erased, not simply gone into nothing, the way they seem to be for so long. They are somewhere. They are a specific place. They left a mark on the physical world that survived 70 years of salt water and current and pressure and the indifferent patience of the deep. An accusation because knowing where the planes are, not knowing what happened between the transmissions and the seabed, means that the core of the mystery is still intact, still sealed, still unreachable by any instrument we currently possess. The scientific explanations are good. They are plausible. They account for much of the evidence. The methane hypothesis, the current patterns, the specific meteorological and geological conditions that the region is now understood to produce with some regularity. These are not fantasy. They are the products of serious research by serious people who have spent careers developing the knowledge to assess them. But science, at its most honest, acknowledges what it cannot reach. And what it cannot reach, in this case, is the gap. Those hours or days between living men and quiet wrecks. That space in which something happened that was decisive and total and that left no trace we can read. There are things the ocean keeps that we will never retrieve. There are questions that the physical evidence will never answer. 11 pilots took off from a runway on the eastern coast of America in 1938. They were experienced and disciplined and prepared. The sky was clear. Their aircraft were in perfect condition. They flew east over the Atlantic, and 90 minutes into the flight something changed. And they made their last transmissions in voices that were confused and uncertain in a way that their training had never produced before. And then they were gone. And 70 years later, divers found their aircraft resting on the seabed in a pattern that suggests not catastrophic failure, but something more controlled, more deliberate, more human than a simple crash. They went down, those aircraft. But they went down the way that a pilot goes down when he has made a decision, when he has chosen the manner of his ending even if he could not choose whether it came. And the pilots themselves. The pilots are not there. Where they are, the ocean is not saying. That is the truth of this story. Not a satisfying truth. Not a neat one. Not the kind of truth that provides the closure that the families deserved and the answer that the investigators needed and the explanation that the history of the Bermuda Triangle demands. But it is the only truth available. And perhaps that is the most honest thing that can be said about the Bermuda Triangle, about the places on this earth where the normal accounting of human events breaks down. Not that they are magical, not that they are supernatural, not that they involve forces beyond science or reason, but that they are, in the end, beyond our reach. That the ocean, which has been here for 4.5 billion years and will be here long after we are all gone, has the patience to keep secrets that we do not have the patience to leave alone. 11 men went into the sky. 70 years later, we found where they went. What happened in between is the province of the deep, and the deep is not speaking. Look at that photograph one more time. 11 young men. 2 rows. Leather jackets. Aircraft noses pointing at a sky that is still, in the photograph, perfectly blue and perfectly ordinary and perfectly innocent of everything that is about to happen. They are smiling. Not because they know something we do not. Not because they are brave in the face of what is coming. They are smiling because they are 22 and 25 and 28 and the morning is clear and the planes are fueled and they are going flying, which is what they trained to do and what they love to do. And there is no reason in the world, standing on that tarmac on that morning in 1938, to feel anything other than the specific joy of a skilled person about to do the thing they are skilled at. That smile is the last thing we have of them. That, and the shapes of their aircraft on the floor of the Atlantic, and the transmission transcripts with their fragmentary confusion, and the files in the archives with their careful language and their inadequate conclusions, and the flowers spreading slowly apart on the surface of the blue Atlantic water. That, and the question, which is not, what happened to those 11 pilots? The question is, what would any of us do in those final moments, when the compass gives impossible readings and the ocean looks wrong and the voice on the other end of the radio is asking calm questions that you no longer have calm answers for? What would any of us do when the sky that was supposed to be a beginning becomes, without warning, an ending? Those 11 men did what trained pilots do. They stayed with their aircraft. They tried to bring them down as controlled as possible. They did not panic. Or if they panicked, they did not let the panic take the controls. In the end, in the only way that the evidence allows us to read it, they faced what was coming with the same composure they brought to everything else. And the ocean received them, and held them, for 70 years, waiting for someone to come and find them. Now you know where they are. The question that remains, the one that the Bermuda Triangle has been asking for decades, the one that these 11 pilots added their voices to with those lost fragmentary transmissions, is one that no expedition and no sonar and no depth of scientific investigation has been able to answer. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But as long as we keep asking it, those 11 men are not entirely gone. They are in the question. They are in the silence between the lost transmission and the seabed. They are in the photograph, still smiling, still standing in front of their aircraft on a morning that was, by all accounts, Just another clear day over the Atlantic. They are still up there, somewhere, in that blue. What do you think really happened to those 11 pilots? Was it a natural phenomenon science still struggles to explain? Or is there something about the Bermuda Triangle that our instruments simply cannot measure? Drop your thoughts below, because this mystery is 70 years old, and it is still asking for answers.